There are moments in a family's history that defy explanation. Stories so strange, they're worn like a faded patch on the family quilt, a story you tell not because it makes sense, but because it's yours. Our story begins with a 1962 Plymouth Belvedere and the unshakable love of a father who promised his children he would eat it. It was the autumn of 1962. The world held its breath over Cuba, but in our small Ohio town, the biggest worry was whether the Indians would ever win the pennant. Our world was the size of a postage stamp. Main Street had a single stoplight. Friday nights were for high school football under those brilliant, buzzing lights, and Sunday mornings were for church, where the scent of starched shirts and hymnals hung thick in the air. And our family, we were a portrait of the times. Mom in her apron, humming along with the radio, the air sweet with the smell of a pot roast. My sister, Susie, lost in a world of 45 RPM records and teen magazines. Me, 10 years old, with a mitt perpetually hooked on my handlebars. And Dad. Oh, Dad. He was a man carved from the same oak as every other father on our block. He worked at the plant, his hands always faintly smelling of machine oil and hard work. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed his love not with words, but by keeping the world, firmly and safely, at bay. But I saw a crack in that steady world. It was a new kind of silence that had settled over our dinner table. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family content. It was a silence filled with the ghost of a television laugh track from the other room. Susie and I, we were drifting. The world was getting bigger, brighter, and it was calling to us from a 21-inch black and white screen. We were becoming strangers in our own home, passengers in the same car, but we were all looking out different windows. Dad saw it. I know he did. He'd watch us, his brow furrowed with a kind of helpless confusion. How do you compete with Annette Funicello and the Shirelles? How does a man who speaks the language of carburetors and overtime pay speak to children learning the dialect of rock and roll? He tried. He'd ask about school, about our friends. We'd offer one-word answers, our eyes already drifting back toward the glow of the television. I see the memory now with a clarity that aches, the look on his face. It wasn't anger. It was a profound and simple sadness. He was losing us. And he, a man who could fix anything with a wrench and a little patience, was utterly powerless to stop it. Then, one Saturday afternoon, it happened. We were at Miller's Chevrolet, the big dealership on the edge of town. They were having a carnival to sell new Impalas. There was popcorn, a clown making balloon animals, and sitting right there on a rotating platform, gleaming under the October sun like a sapphire, was a brand new 1962 Plymouth Belvedere. It was a spaceship. 2 doors, a sweeping fins, a grille that looked like it was smiling at the future. Susie and I were mesmerized. We pressed our noses against its cool, clean glass, dreaming out loud. Wouldn't it be something to drive to California in that? Susie sighed. We could go to Disneyland. I shouted, my voice cracking with the sheer possibility of it all. They just opened it. They've got a real castle. Dad stood behind us, his hands in his pockets. He looked from the car to our faces, alight with a wonder he hadn't put there, and then back to the car. And then he said it. The words that would define our family forever. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the carnival noise like a knife. That's a lot of car, he said. We turned to look at him. He had a strange, almost mischievous glint in his eye, a look we hadn't seen in a long, long time. I'll tell you what, he said, leaning in close like he was sharing a state secret. I bet I could eat that whole thing. Silence. Susie and I just stared. We thought it was a joke. A bad one. But his face was deadly serious. You're kidding, I said. Dad shook his head slowly. No, sir. I bet I can. It might take me a while, but I bet I can eat that entire automobile. He looked from me to Susie, his eyes locking with ours. And if I do, you have to promise me something. We were hooked. The car, Disneyland, it was all forgotten. What? Susie breathed. Dad smiled, a real, genuine smile. You have to promise to talk to me at the dinner table again. No more grunts. Real words. And you have to help me. The absurdity was breathtaking. It was the most ridiculous thing we had ever heard. And it was the most wonderful. We laughed. We laughed until our sides hurt, right there in the middle of that car lot. And for the first time in months, we were all laughing together. The bet was on. He started the very next day. Dad, the most practical man alive, became a man possessed by the most impractical quest imaginable. He didn't have the money to buy the car, of course. That wasn't the point. The point was the doing. The point was, us. He went down to the junkyard and bought a scrap 58 DeSoto that was more rust than steel. He had it towed into our backyard, right next to Mom's petunia bed. And that's where our new family project began. Mom. God bless her, she didn't bat an eye. She just looked at that hulking wreck in her garden, looked at Dad's determined face, and sighed a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. Then she tied her apron a little tighter and said, "Well, you're not doing it on an empty stomach." That was her love language. Acceptance. And meatloaf. Our garage was transformed from a place of oil changes and lawnmower storage into a laboratory of the absurd. Dad, with his machinist's precision, began the meticulous process of disassembling the DeSoto. But this wasn't just taking it apart. This was preparation. He'd come home from the plant, eat the dinner Mom had made, and then we'd all go out to the garage. Susie and I, our curiosity thoroughly piqued, were his assistants. He'd point to a bolt. Socket wrench, 1/4 inch. I'd hand it to him. Susie, get the jar labeled rear left fender, section 2. And she would. He had a system. Every piece, no matter how small, was cataloged. Nuts, bolts, strips of chrome, wires, all went into meticulously labeled mason jars and coffee cans that began to line the garage shelves. It looked like the world's most bizarre pantry. The neighbors talked, of course. How could they not? Old Man Miller from next door would lean over the fence, his brow furrowed. "What in the Sam Hill are you doing, John?" Dad would just wipe the grease from his forehead and smile. "Supper, Fred." "Just working on supper." And Fred would just shake his head and wander back to his perfectly manicured lawn. The rumors flew. Some thought he'd lost his marbles. Some thought it was a brilliant commentary on modern consumerism. The local paper even sent a reporter, a young kid who wrote a small, amused piece titled, "Local Man Attempts to Dine on DeSoto." We became a minor local oddity. But inside that garage, it wasn't odd at all. It was magic. Dad talked as we worked. He told us stories about his own father, about the war, about how he'd met Mom at a sock hop and been so nervous he'd stepped on her feet all night. We talked about school, about our fears, about our dreams. The silence was gone, replaced by the clinking of tools and the sound of our voices, weaving together again. The car was the excuse. The conversation was the point. Then came the eating. The day the first piece was ready. It was a small bolt, maybe an inch long. Dad had spent hours on it. He'd taken it to his workbench at the plant and used a grinding wheel to pulverize it into a fine, metallic powder. He brought it home in a tiny envelope. After dinner, with the solemnity of a scientist conducting a vital experiment, he laid the envelope on the table. We all gathered around. Mom, Susie, me. He poured the faintly glittering powder onto a spoon. "Okay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The inaugural bite." He looked at us. "Milk, please, Susie." She scurried to get it. He placed the powder on his tongue, swallowed it down in one grimacing gulp, and chased it with the entire glass of milk. He sat for a moment, his eyes wide. Then he let out a tremendous "Ayaha!" We all jumped. Then he grinned. "Tastes like progress." That was the ritual. Every single night. After Mom's cooking, her meatloaf, her fried chicken, her beef stew, we would have our dessert. A spoonful of car. Dad would grind, or file, or pulverize some piece of that DeSoto. A sliver of glass reduced to fine sand. A piece of rubber tire shaved into black dust. A length of copper wire chopped into microscopic pieces. He'd mix it into his applesauce or his pudding, close his eyes, and swallow it down. It became the most normal thing in the world. "Don't forget your car, Dad," I'd say, passing him the bowl of applesauce with its metallic sprinkles. "Thank you, son," he'd reply, as if I'd just passed the salt. Mom watched it all with a quiet, worried pride. She made him see Dr. Evans every month for x-rays and checkups. The doctor, utterly baffled, would just report that Dad's constitution was like iron. We all found that hilarious. The years just flowed. The Beatles came and went. Man landed on the moon. The war in Vietnam flickered on our television screen. And in our backyard, the DeSoto slowly, steadily, disappeared. 1965, the front left fender was gone. 1967, the entire engine block, painstakingly filed down over 18 months, was consumed. I got my driver's license. Susie went to her senior prom. Through it all, the ritual held. The dinner table was our anchor. We talked about everything. The bet was never about the car. Not really. It was about the time. The shared, secret, wonderfully bizarre project that forced us to be together, to talk, to look each other in the eye. That car was the loom on which our family was rewoven. I left for college in 1970. The DeSoto was half gone. Susie was already gone, married to her high school sweetheart and living in Cleveland. The house was quieter. But every time I came home for break, the first thing I'd do is go out to the garage. The jars were still there. The coffee cans. And Dad, a little grayer, a little more stooped, would be at his workbench, filing away at a piece of the transmission. "Hey, Dad," I'd say. He'd look up, his eyes crinkling. "Hey, kid. Hand me that course file, will ya? This gear's tougher than your mother's meatloaf." And we'd fall right back into the rhythm. He'd ask about my classes, about my life. And he'd listen. He'd really listen. The bet was still on. He was a man of his word. The final bite was eaten on a crisp Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1975. I was home for the weekend. The DeSoto was gone. All that remained was a single, final bolt from the driver's side door handle. It sat on a piece of velvet on the kitchen table, like a jewel. Dad had polished it until it shone. Mom had made a chocolate pudding, his favorite. We were all there. Me, Susie, her husband, their new baby, Mom. There was no laughter this time. It was a ceremony. 13 years. Thousands of meals. Thousands of conversations. Dad looked at us, his family, his eyes shimmering. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a smile that held every single one of those 13 years inside it. He placed the bolt on his tongue, took a bite of the pudding, and swallowed. He closed his eyes. And it was over. The bet was won. We all applauded, tears in our eyes. We had witnessed something impossible. We had helped create it. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Dad sitting on the back porch, looking out at the empty spot where the DeSoto had sat for so long. The moon was high and bright. I sat down next to him. The silence between us was the good kind now, the comfortable kind. After a long while, he spoke, his voice soft and gravelly with time. "You kids," he began, then paused, searching for the words. "You kids were growing up so fast. And that world, it was so loud. So bright. I couldn't. I didn't know how to keep up. I was afraid I'd already lost you." He turned to me, and in the moonlight, I could see the truth shining in his eyes. It wasn't a glint of mischief anymore. It was the pure, unvarnished truth of a father's love. "I knew I couldn't give you Disneyland. I couldn't give you the world. But I could give you my time. I could give you my attention. I needed a reason for you to give me yours." He looked out at the yard again. "So I gave you the silliest, most impossible thing I could think of. I gave you a car, to eat." He let out a soft, weary laugh. "And you know what? It worked." That was the twist. The final, heart-stopping revelation. It was never about the bet. It was never about the absurdity. It was a desperate, brilliant, and profoundly loving act of a father who felt himself becoming obsolete in his children's eyes. He built us a universe of focused attention out of scrap metal and stubbornness. He used a ridiculous promise to make a sacred one, that he would always be there, that he would always listen, that he would always find a way to be a part of our world, even if he had to literally consume a piece of it to do it. My father passed away in 1988, full of years and, the doctor assured us with a bewildered shake of his head, a perfectly normal amount of iron. We cleaned out the garage after the funeral. On the highest shelf, behind a can of dried-up paint, we found one last mason jar. It had a faded, yellowing label written in Dad's precise hand. It didn't say door handle bolt or chrome trim. It said, simply, "Time with my kids." 1962 to 1975, the jar was empty. He had consumed every last second of it. And we had feasted on it with him. He didn't eat a car to win a bet, he did it to win back his family. And every single bite was filled with love.